Thank you for joining us. I have Dr. John West, who's a breast surgeon, here with us, and we are going to talk about breast cancer in women under 40. Okay, I know we've talked before about the 40, not 50
Starting
campaign.
yearly mammograms at age 40 and doing it properly. We won't get into that, but we can cut breast cancer mortality better than in half. We have fantastic. We do have a problem with women under 40 because they're not doing self-exam. They're not getting any form of screening imaging. So we basically wait till a lump develops. And oftentimes when a patient tells the doctor she found a lump, they say, it's just fibrocystic. Oh, you're a hysterical female. They don't address it properly. So that's why women need to be armed with the information. They need to say, no, I need a diagnostic ultrasound. I need to have you check that because that may not be cancer, but if it is, I want to know it right now. Right. And if you just have that simple rule, you add a few other things, but that's a starting point. So it's not as hard as one might think. It's just that we've ignored women under 40 because it's not as common in that age group. Only at the most 10% of the women are diagnosed under 40.
Right. Well, then also, though, as a patient, maybe people feel a little intimidated and are afraid to ask for something like that.
I hope not in this day and age, but I think that is true. And certainly women get discouraged because when they think about checking their breasts, it's usually right before their period, and they feel all this lumpiness and tenderness, and they go, well, I never feel cancer on that breast. Mm-hmm. They're right. It is about, you have to wait for about 5 to 10 days for the effect of the estrogen to drop and so the breasts get less bumpy and less tender. And that's the perfect time to do the self-exam. And every woman should at least be familiar with the normal breast. Ideally, they should be checking it once a month, 5 to 10 days after the period. I've been trying to promote that for a long time, a little discouraged, but it can save a life. Right. And just being aware of your normal breast tissue, spending some time when you're least bumpy, 5 or 10 days after your period, and just learning, getting a mindset of what the mental limit. Once your brain has a mental picture and you check them, you'll pick up a subtle change because the brain is designed to pick up changes like that. It's very effective. Okay. So what I think then they're worried about, well, they come in with a little subtle change and the doctor says, no, it's just fibrosis. No, don't worry. It doesn't run in your family. There's a million reasons why. You say, no, this is simple. No, I want a diagnostic ultrasound. If that's negative, fine. It probably will be 9 times out of 10. Right. But if it's positive, you're going to save your life.
Exactly. Okay, so let's talk about breast cancers in women under 40. Is it more popular now? Are we seeing more?
There's a slight increase in the under 40 age group, but I don't know if it's that big a deal compared to other factors. I think we have to realize that women under 40, when they get a cancer, tends to be a little more aggressive, and that's one of our problems. And of course, with the screening we do, it seems like almost always we find these little bitty things you can't feel, but we're not screening women in that age group unless they're high risk. Now, if we find a woman whose mother had it or sister had it at a young age, we do BRCA testing, BRCA 1 and 2, as we did with Angelina Jolie. Right. If those women have a mutation, then we start screening as early as 25, and we start with the MRI yearly.
Okay.
So it really is important for women who are high risk to know that they're really different and they absolutely need the yearly screening. Now, women, say, whose mother was diagnosed with breast cancer at 45 should do it 10 years earlier, so she should do it at 35. Okay. And these rules are often not followed, but they can be life-saving. Right. And so I think a woman needs to understand her risk. Women like Ashkenazi Jewish background or maybe more distant relatives with breast or ovarian may be at risk. I had a young woman who was diagnosed with breast cancer in her early 40s. She had 0 family history. Well, I went back and checked and checked and checked. Finally, her great-grandfather had male breast cancer who passed it on to her grandfather who passed it on to her father, but none of the men got it. Right. So it was a silent mutation. And so any woman out there could have a silent mutation, but if you have a strong family history, by all means do risk assessment and determine what is the most effective way that you should do screening. Okay. And probably find a doctor in a high-risk clinic, or at least a surgeon or somebody who's really interested in early detection, because if you are higher risk, it's just better if you're followed in an environment where they really are interested. And I think if your OBGYN isn't checking your breast when you're going for your woman exam, you might say, hey, maybe you ought to be checking them, or maybe you ought to find somebody who does, because
Right.
you can't be expected to know it as well as you'd know it if you checked it after somebody with medical experience says this is normal for you.
Right.
Once the normal breast is identified, you just say, all I need to do is learn the pattern. And it takes a few days of going over both breasts completely, and finally you say, okay, I'm familiar with it, so I'll do it, once a month.
Okay.
And if there's a change, then I'll report it.
Okay. Now, we've heard of cases where there are women who are even younger than 35 because of possible radiation exposure of some sort. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, there is general agreement that if you've had, for instance, Hodgkin's disease in your teens, you are at very high risk for early onset breast cancer. So they're just as high as if you had a BRCA mutation, so they should also start MRI screening at age 25. And they should be followed in a high-risk clinic. So we know just doing excessive mammograms or chest x-rays in a young age can lead to a higher risk. But now we're aware of that, and they use lead shields, and we try to use as little as possible. But I know what you're referring to here, and you're talking about the cell phone.
Yep.
And people are skeptical. I went on the Oz show to talk about a 21-year-old who had been recently diagnosed. She started putting her cell phone in her bra at age 17. She put it in her bra when she woke up, and she took it out of her bra. And so she had about 12, 14 hours of exposure. Her mom was just nervous as could be about it. And finally she develops a cancer. One of my other 21-year-old patients had a cancer that was exactly the length and width of her cell phone. The calcification was right near the surface. I mean, it was mind-boggling. So I'm convinced there's a relationship. And I think mothers particularly should tell their daughters to make the bra no phone zone. Keep that cell phone out of the bra. If you want to have a cell phone, put it in a purse or a side pack or a fanny pack. There's other ways of doing it.
Right.
But this idea of particularly with teenage girls when the breast is developing, and of course more and more the younger and younger women have access to cell phones, and so a convenient place to put it is in your bra. And I think sometimes if you're in school or something, it's a cool thing to do. You're hiding it. The teacher's not going to look in your bra.
Right.
So,
well, if I was an inventor, I would invent some sort of a film to go over the front of the phone.
Well, they have a bunch of these that are marketed, and it turns out that you can't get reception with the ones that they've had so far. So. I don't know if you could put a lead shield on
Lead shield. We're going to now have lead shields on our phones.
I don't think I could sell that one.
No.
But I think just keeping it out, just make the bra a no phone zone.
Now remember, no phone zones in your bra. Because you're right, you can always do a pocket or something else.
You can find something.
Yeah.
Use a little creativity, yeah.
Well, especially with the possibility of some sort of radiation exposure with this. So,
right. It can be big.
Now, we talked about early detection being the key and women checking their breasts. What are some other things that you would recommend them doing to help steer clear of any breast cancer?
Well, let's go to risk first, and then I'll go to diet and risk reduction strategy. So in terms of the risk assessment, we've already touched on it, but every woman should make an attempt to know whether she has breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and really other cancers in the family. We're learning more and more of it is genetically based, or at least a certain percentage of colon cancer, pancreatic cancer. So all these things, once we identify them, and now it's so inexpensive. When Angelina Jolie had her testing, it was $4,000 for 2 genes, BRCA1, BRCA2. There's now 32 genes that we check out, that we analyze for $200.
Oh, there we go.
And sometimes insurance will pay for that. But if you for $200, it's a great Christmas present or something, to give somebody, pay for that $200 test and have them have their blood tested. It's relatively simple. Or just send in saliva is all that it takes. So it's very simple. It's a local company here, and there's so much competition now that 23andMe and a lot of these companies are really trying to get the analysis done so women can be protected. You see, if it's negative, you know that you're not going to pass it on to the next generation. And future generations know that you didn't pass it on. So that's really, really important information. However, if you're positive, this changes everything.
Right.
Then, whatever age you are, even I wouldn't know about maybe age 21 on, but maybe a few 18-year-olds might want to talk about it. You tell them just, relax, but we usually start more aggressive screening at 25. But if I had a daughter, I think I would talk to her at 18 and say, I want you to have it by 21.
Yeah.
So I don't think I'm going to have any daughters in the near future, but if I did, my granddaughter.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, I'll say it'll be a long time before she's 21.
Yeah. You know, something you mentioned, you said ovarian cancer. Is there a correlation if someone in my family's had ovarian cancer
Absolutely,
that I could get
yeah.
ovarian and other cancers?
If you have ovarian in the family, that's of a greater risk than having breast in the cancer for this BRCA1 and 2 mutation.
Okay.
So, but ovarian cancer is much less common, so we don't hear as much about it. But if we see breast and ovarian in the same family, then we know we're at higher probability of coming up with a positive. So it's really important for particularly younger women, but really all women, to know your family history, jot it down. One of the important things we do, in addition to just genetic testing in our clinic, is create a whole family pedigree, so we know, and as new information comes in, we update it. So by the time future generations want that information, it'll be very detailed, and we'll have the information to really analyze them. I think it's not going to be long till at birth you're going to have these things have the opportunity to have it done. And maybe some people can make some concerns about why you wouldn't want to do it, and I'm sure there are people that would. But to me, it's illogical. The only logical thing, because there's so many other things we're going to be testing for. So I think I'm not pushing that right now, but I think theoretically we're very aggressive about. In fact, one of the most common groups that we get this additional testing on is women who we've operated on previously for breast cancer, and they say, well, I want to make sure my grandkids or my kids don't get it. So they get tested. Most of the time they're negative, and then nobody else has to get tested because they know it's not going to the mother. Of course, you still have to look at the father's side. Right,
okay. And then also you mentioned to reducing the risk. So that's through a testing. What are some of the other things?
Well, you know, people say, why is so higher incidence in Orange County? I mean, we're a healthy county, very well off. Well, it's because we're well off that we're having problems. Girls develop quickly. They don't exercise like somebody who's living out on a farm, so they tend to be overweight. They tend to eat the wrong kind of food, you know, the fast food, the McDonald's burgers and whatever, high-end fats, high-end chemicals, you know, and things that may predispose them to that. So I think having a good, healthy diet now, the teenagers, you know, don't necessarily want to eat, just, you know, minimize the meat, they love the processed food, they love the sugar, they love the carbohydrates, but by eating a high carbohydrate sugar diet, it's very hard to control your weight. And if you want to lose weight, just get rid of the carbs, get rid of the sugar. Then it becomes pretty straightforward. But the problem is the sugar, the carbs are absorbed almost immediately. So you eat it, get a lot of calories, and you're hungry again in a half an hour. And so you need to eat more. Whereas if you eat something that's like an avocado that's high in plant fat, very slowly absorbed, so you get a lot of, you burn the whole thing off before you're hungry again, and so it carries you a lot longer, and you don't get hungry so quickly. Okay, so controlling your weight is really key. Right, and then there's the issue of alcohol. So there's some pretty good data that binge drinking, like college girls who are more and more inclined to binge drink. They can't drink during the week, but they have 7 or 8, 9 margaritas with their enchiladas and tacos and stuff, and it's so easy to do that because it's a social thing. But spreading it out, having no more than one a day, is probably a lot better than having 7 in one day, even for adults. But if you have a risk, you know, a strong risk of breast cancer in the family, maybe something you would think about is really controlling that, even at a young age. Okay. Yeah. Good.
Well, good to know. I mean, all of the things that you've mentioned have been very helpful, but you also have a book that we could dive into even more. So why don't we just touch quickly on your book?
Well, here's why I wrote it. I can't convince women to do self-exam. I don't have the time. I think if I had a lot of time with them, I can't. I know there's a lot of women out there that aren't getting good advice. They have breast problems. I've had women who have bounced around for almost a year and the cancer has spread before somebody made the diagnosis. Now that's unusual, but we find that if we're proactive in terms of screening, doing an exam, particularly the ultrasound for younger women, the combination of mammogram plus screening ultrasound for older 40 and over women, and then for women that are high risk or have very dense breasts, consider adding the MRI. You put all those things together for women over 40, and we're going to save so many lives, it's unbelievable. Right. But people, the doctors just don't have the time to explain all these things. A classic example of that is a woman with dense breasts. About half of women, their breasts are dense, particularly the younger women. Well, mammograms don't work very well in dense breasts, so you have to add an ultrasound. When you do the 3D mammogram plus the screening ultrasound, you double the pickup of small cancers. Very few doctors really are aware of that or have the time to discuss it. Right now, we're on the computer all the time. We're constantly, doing paperwork. It's very hard to get in these lengthy discussions. Yeah. One of the other discussions that's difficult to get into, but very important, is the hormones. So the birth control pills that we use now, fortunately, the data is looking very good on those. Okay. It looks very safe because they're low dose. The previous ones were a bit of a problem. Now, for women 50 and over, or women who go into menopause, a lot of them need hormone replacement, but if they have an intact uterus, in other words, they have not had a hysterectomy, if they take the combination of estrogen and progesterone for more than 4 years, their cancer risk goes up. Right. And the longer they do it, the more. Now there's a drug out called Duovi. I've got a whole chapter on that here. Okay. Where else are you going to get this information? It's not out there. Right. But you can take that safely, get the estrogen you need to control your menopausal symptoms. You will be a happier person for it, and you're not running the increased risk of getting a breast cancer.
Oh, that's great. That's
great. So it is great.
So all of the information that we've talked about and information that you could probably search in various places is all contained in one spot. I
think everything you need to know for early diagnosis, maximize your chance of, living through breast cancer or catching it early. Everything is in here, and it goes into what you do if, in fact, you've just been diagnosed with cancer. But the main part is education for the general public. Right. If we could get the public 80 or 90% more involved in this sort of thing, we would eliminate breast cancer as a top cause of death in young women. We'll never eliminate it completely, but we're making a lot of progress in other areas that will help us treat it more effectively. So I sure like to see by the next generation that breast cancer is no longer the problem that it is today. Right. Follow the advice here and you'll protect yourself.
Perfect, and perfectly said. Thank you very much for the information.
Thank you for asking me. I enjoyed it.
And remember that determining your risk is really a key, and also controlling your weight and cutting back on alcohol too. Well, thank you for joining us. I have Dr. Patrick Alore, who is here with Radnet, and we're going to be talking about lung screening CT. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, lung cancer screening, tell me a little bit about what's involved with that particular process.
Sure. For lung cancer screening at Radnet, we use a CT scanner to take hundreds of images through the lungs, looking for small lung nodules. And for those of you watching that don't know, a lung nodule is a small bump in the lungs that could be a benign finding, or in other words, not worrisome, but it could also be a precursor to lung cancer.
Wow, so now what are those nodules made of?
The nodules they could be made of cancer cells, or they could be made of old infectious areas and scars in the lungs. And what we're really worried about is that they're made of cancer cells.
Okay, all right. So now how did you get involved with this? I know we were going to kind of start out with that, but So, you said that you had a relative that was
Correct.
diagnosed with lung cancer, but that was after you had already gotten into this. Tell me a little bit about how that happened.
Sure. Well, my grandmother was a long-term smoker, and she did develop lung nodules, which turned out over a period of time to be lung cancer, and she did pass away from that.
Okay.
So although I was already doing this, I studied at UCSF, body imaging, abdominal imaging, and some cancer imaging, and that's what I do with Radnet now. When I do look at these scans, it does fall close to home because I've had relatives who've had lung nodules and
Right.
have passed away from lung nodules or lung cancer.
Right, okay. So medical director of body imaging, and you just kind of gave us a little bit of an idea of what that is, but body imaging from head to toe, or how does that work?
Yeah, so body imaging basically is talking about the chest, abdomen, and pelvis, and the imaging of pathologies or diseases that are related to those body parts. And it would not include the extremities, which would be more of a musculoskeletal imager, or the brain and spine, which would be a neuroimager or
Okay.
a neuroradiologist.
Okay, so then you went from doing that to specifically lung cancer screening, or do you do
Correct.
all of it still?
I do all of it still, but I'm focused pretty heavily on lung cancer screening.
Okay, all right. Let's kind of jump into who needs to be screened for lung cancer.
Okay, so patients that are at high risk for lung cancer are the ones that should really be screened, and that's specifically patients that have a long-term history of smoking.
Okay.
And long-term is defined by Medicare as 30 pack years of smoking. So that could mean 1 pack a day for 30 years, or that could mean 2 packs a day for 15 years, and you can do the math. But basically a long-term history of smoking. The patients could be former smokers or previous smokers, and they must be between the ages of 55 and 80 years old.
Oh, okay. Now, would you agree with all of those parameters?
Well, I understand that when you're dealing with a whole population of people, that's probably going to be the most efficient way and cost-effective way for our nation to screen for and treat lung cancer. But say if you had a patient who, and if you were a primary care doctor and you had a patient who was maybe 50 and said, well, I've smoked since I was 14 years old, and you might still want the patient to get the lung cancer screening CT. Now, health insurance might not cover it, but they can still pay out of pocket.
Okay. Okay, so I'm wondering if, after all of the studies that you've done so far and some of the new findings that are coming out today, do you think that they might change those parameters, especially if somebody smoked less?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, right now, if you have a negative test, it's recommended that you get the test every year.
Okay.
From the age of 55 to 80. Now, I feel like as time goes by, when more data is collected, that recommendation of getting a test every year, even if it's negative, might become less frequent.
I see.
But that's a good point. But there's just not enough data right now.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And then, so you said maybe every year for some of those people.
Correct.
Right,
So
okay.
even if you're negative every year, if you have a small lung nodule, it would also be every year, and they would look at the nodule to make sure it's stable and not growing.
Okay.
And if the nodule is a little bit bigger, they might do an earlier follow-up, such as like a 3 or 6 month CT scan again. And if it's even larger, they would do a more advanced imaging test, which is a PET CT, and it specifically looks for cancer cells.
Okay.
And if it's even larger, they would just go right ahead and do a biopsy.
Okay. Now, how would a patient know when they're supposed to be getting their screening?
Okay, so well, they should definitely speak with their primary care physician, and if they fit into the category of the age and the smoking history, then they qualify for the study. Now, once the patient does have the study, they'll receive a letter in the mail that says what the findings of the study are and when they should return for follow-up.
Okay.
Their doctor will also receive the same letter and a report that documents that, so they can coordinate with the scheduler who schedules the imaging test with their doctor, and there'll be multiple people in the know of when they should follow up.
Okay, perfect. Now, you talk a lot about nodules and what they're made of. So if a nodule is found initially, the next step then would be to have it diagnosed, or?
Right. So if the nodule is small enough, the patient can just follow up in 1 year again.
Okay.
So just making sure that it's stable. But if it's larger than, say, 6 millimeters, they might need to do a 3-month scan.
Okay.
Because it's more worrisome, so you'd want to watch it closer because it's more likely to be cancer. And then once it gets to like 8 millimeters or 1 centimeter, then it's seriously worrisome, and it's going to either need a biopsy or that imaging test which looks for cancer cells, the PET CT.
The PET CT. Okay, great. Now, is it only smokers who should have regular lung cancer screenings, or what are some of the other risk factors other than the 30-pack and things like that? Are there some other ones?
Right, there are other risk factors for developing lung cancer, but again, like we said, it's for smokers and former smokers.
Okay.
But outside of smoking, there's other environmental causes for lung cancer, such as pollution from living in a city, say.
Okay.
Some studies have shown that living in a really polluted city, New York City, say 20 years ago, with a lot of smog, or maybe a large Chinese city where there's a lot of coal in the air, coal fuels,
Okay.
is just as bad as smoking a pack a day. Now, so those patients would also be at risk for lung cancer. However, the test is really not meant for them, and the studies that were done showing how accurate the test is and how helpful the test is weren't done on those patient groups, really only on smokers.
Okay.
So if you do have a history of other risk factors for lung cancer, those environmental factors, maybe some occupational exposure, say if you were a fireman, or asbestos exposure if you worked in a shipyard,
Right.
then even though you don't qualify for the study, you could speak to your doctor and say that you're concerned about lung cancer nonetheless, and maybe you could
Right.
get this test, and if your insurance doesn't cover it, just pay out of pocket.
Okay, all right, great. Now, with the onset of the legalization of smoking marijuana and also vaping and things like that, how does that differ from regular cigarette smoking in affecting the lungs?
Right, and that's an interesting question. There's not a lot of long-term data on either vaping or marijuana in large populations yet. Now, the most recent studies on marijuana show that smoking marijuana, I'm not talking about vaping it, but just smoking it, does increase your risk for lung cancer, although older studies would disagree with that. But the newest studies say it increases a little bit, and I don't think there's enough data yet to say how much does it increase it, or if
Right.
it increases it more or less than cigarette smoking.
Right.
I have a feeling that over the long term, it probably is less than cigarette smoking, less of a risk factor.
Right.
But we'll see. As far as vaping goes, again, not a lot of long-term data. Vaping is relatively new, and the
Right.
population studies that have been done are relatively small. But the chemicals in vaping include formaldehyde, heavy metals, and other chemicals in the flavoring. So those could also potentially cause lung cancer.
Right.
How much? I think the long-term
Right.
studies will have to, show that. The jury is out.
Right.
But it's probably, again, less than cigarette smoking, than traditional cigarette smoking.
Well, because you probably don't have, like you said, not the same ingredients, right? I mean,
Correct.
you've got nicotine and a variety of other things in a
Yes.
cigarette as opposed to vaping or even marijuana, because you don't have all the same things.
Exactly. There's a lot more carcinogens in cigarette smoke than there are in the vaping,
Right.
but there
Right.
are still some in vaping, and some in vaping that aren't in the cigarettes, like the plastics and the metals that are in the material
Right.
of the vape itself.
Even the formaldehyde. I mean, there's
Yeah.
formaldehyde in food and
That's true.
and other types of medications. And so, I mean, anytime you're going to pollute your body with something like that, you could have risk of probably getting anything.
Very true. Very
Right.
true.
And also, you mentioned that just possibly living in a city that has lots of cars and coal and things like that could also. And the other thing that you said that was kind of interesting is that firemen, because I always wonder, smelling a lot of that smoke, and when they're just, I mean, I know they have protective gear on, but often, especially with 9/11, there was a lot of problems with the first responders.
Right. There were untold chemicals that were thrown up into the air when the Twin Towers collapsed, and those have caused many respiratory problems in the firefighters.
Right.
Other than not just cancer, but I think the long-term studies will probably show they have an increased risk of cancer as well.
Right, right.
yeah.
Oh gosh, a lot of things to think about for sure. Any last few words here you'd like to tell everybody of some of the things they should be looking out for?
Well, other than if you have a high risk for lung cancer and you've smoked a lot, you should get this study. But all of the other screening tests that we should all get, for women, mammograms; for men, testicular self-screening.
Right.
Breast self-screening for women as well, not just mammograms. And then when you're age appropriate, colon cancer screening with colonoscopy as well.
Right, and Radnet can provide all of that.
Correct.
Perfect. Thank you very much for being with us.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us.